From Michael Locke and Victoria Holland, and Councillor David Hopkins, Cabinet Member, also gave his apologies.
Okay, has anybody got any disclosures of interest? Okay, thank you. And just a reminder as well that there is a prohibition on whip votes, as this is a scrutiny panel. If we just have a quick look then to the minutes, which are attached to the agenda, which you should receive through electronically. If we want to check them for accuracy, if I can take them page by page. First one is page 1. Okay. And then simply page 2. Is anybody happy to say that they're a true and accurate record? Okay, so I can see Councillor Jeffrey in the room. And is that Sue Jones as well? Oh, Chris Holly. Okay, thank you. So if we just move on then, item 5, there are no public questions have been received. So if we move on to the main parts of business today, which is item 6, the legal aspects of community asset transfer. We're joined today by Debbie Smith and online on Sally Ann Evans, who is a lead legal lawyer on property. I understand that Sally Ann is going to just do a little introduction on the aspects of questions that we asked for. And hopefully then we can ask for any follow-up questions or any further information. If I pass you over to you then, Sally Ann, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just to start off, thank you for providing us with the questions beforehand. The role of the legal department is to assist any client department and property services in transferring public owned land and buildings to community ownership and management. Any proposal for a community asset transfer must be supported by a head of service and the relevant cabinet member. If the proposal does not have any internal support, then it cannot proceed. A community and or voluntary sector groups or town and community council applying for asset transfers need to comply with the stages set out in the CAT policy, which is set out in the Constitution. The legal department's initial involvement should be prior to any decision to proceed. This would be involved in preparing a report on title of the land and buildings, to consider the land, to confirm whether any legal restraints on transferring the land to the community and or voluntary groups. They would also include any advice on whether a public open space notice needs to be advertised in accordance with the legislation. It is established that if a public open space notice is necessary, instructions would come from property services to carry out that, publish the same. The legal department would have no further role in the CAT procedure until detailed terms are agreed and instructions have been received from property services to transfer the land and or buildings. So that's where our involvement would come back into force. Regarding your question with single point of contact, organisations would have no contact with legal until formal instructions have been received. If the organisation is represented by a firm of solicitors, the legal officer would communicate directly with that firm. It's an established principle under the Solicitors Regulation Authority standards and regulations. A solicitor cannot communicate directly with another solicitor's client. So that's often an issue where we get contacted directly by one of the organisations. We would have to say, unfortunately, we can't discuss it directly with you. We have to go via your solicitor. Sometimes they don't understand the reason why, but it is because we are governed by the Law Society and the Solicitors Regulation Authority. The key challenges. Prior to legal being instructed, the community and voluntary sector groups or the town community council would have been in detailed correspondence and negotiations with the council. Legal at the last stage of the CAT procedure, often the organisation would have undertaken lengthy negotiations prior to legal being instructed. This sometimes leads to the organisation not appreciate the complexity of the work that is required by legal to implement the terms that have been agreed. How we deal with these challenges, an appreciation by the organisation of the procedure and timescales involved in the community asset transfer would assist, including the various departments' involvement at the outset. Each transfer is unique, and although many of the terms of a lease are similar, it's not ever straightforward. And the final question you asked us was how we'd think the CAP process could be improved more widely. It's not really something for legal to address. However, a dedicated team dealing with community asset transfers would improve the process, I believe, personally. And meetings at the outset between the relevant departments on how to approach any possible CAP process would also assist, I believe.
Thank you, Sally Ann. Is there anything you wanted to add, Debbie?
Just to say, Chair, that yes, that legal department's involvement is we only act on instructions, so we don't take part in any part of the process that's around the selection of the land, the negotiations, or anything of that nature. We really do come in just to do the due diligence on the land that's been selected. And Sally Ann has already pointed out, we would the title and check that there's nothing restricting how the council can dispose of that land. So that due diligence bit at the outset, but then we only get involved when instructions are received and the deal has been done, all but putting it on paper. So in terms of the selection and any of the difficulties there may be with the negotiation phases, we don't get involved in any of that. So just to make it clear that there are set sort of parameters really for what we can do and how we can influence it.
Okay, thank you. I see, is it a hand from you, Chris? Would you like to come in?
Yeah, there is. A couple of things really. One, I would have thought that forget about due diligence on the individuals that are coming, or companies, or communities, or community councils, or football teams, or whatever that are coming forward. I would have thought we had all the title deed and all the instructions that we need for our own land. So really, there would be no need for us to do anything for our own properties. It was only the person that is coming to do the asset swap would be examined. Is that correct?
In terms of the due diligence of the actual organisation and who we're doing business with, that wouldn't come to legal. That would be more a matter for the client department together with finance colleagues or whoever would be best placed to look at the strength or otherwise of the financial resilience of the people that we're dealing with. In terms of the legal due diligence of the land, yes, we always do that because, well, Sally Ann can provide some more details, but as you know, the council's land holdings are vast. We always check the title because the title can change and there can be any number of things that could affect how we do it. Again, public open space notices are a tricky one, as you probably come across. The way the land has been used can, again, inform what kind of steps we need to take to be able to dispose of it. So Sally Ann's probably a better place to answer directly, but my understanding is, yes, we would need to check. Even with our own land, we would need to do those checks.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Sally Ann?
Yeah, that's correct. Although we own the title to the property, there may be restrictions on it, so things that we can and can't do on the land. The way we've purchased the land, there may be something in the original conveyance which prevents us from doing certain things with the title, certain covenants that affect the title also. So yes, we do have to do due diligence on the land itself prior to it being proceeded down the transfer route. But that would be at the outset. So to ensure, for example, if there's public open space, we'd have to comply with those regulations. Also, if it's a playing field and it's not going to be transferred to a group that's continuing with the playing field, we'd have to comply with the playing field regulations that affect Wales as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I've got just a couple of questions to sort of follow up with. One of the things that's come out through the process of this inquiry so far is the idea of a single person of contact. And I know you mentioned it in your comments earlier, Sally Ann. Do you feel that would be very useful for you to be able to deal with somebody that almost deals with everybody else in the process to try and bring things together? So if we were to be able to identify a role or an individual, would that be useful for legal?
Yeah, yes. If for example, not for legal to have a single point of contact with the externals, but with internal departments, that would be very helpful. Yeah. So if there was a group, for example, that could meet at the outset when somebody addresses or comes to the council to say we are interested in this parcel of land, maybe that one person could go there and have the knowledge at the outset. This might be a possibility.
Okay, that's great, because I think that reflects quite a lot of what we've already heard in the discussions. The second point I have is that, do you feel, and this is a point for you and Debbie, I suppose, to pick up, do you feel that legal is engaged early enough in the process? So maybe at first sight or first idea stage of it, in terms of for those rudimentary checks of covenants or purpose of land or ownership or use. Do you feel that at the moment do you feel that you need to be like a gatekeeper before it develops too much as an idea?
I do feel that we should have prior knowledge of any community asset transfers or proposals of people coming forward. We may, and in fairness, we get asked to do reports on title, but not always we know the reason behind that report on title. We just provide a report on title. And maybe the next stage that we become aware of it is when we clear in reports that are going to Cabinet to say we are looking to transfer this land. And at that point, obviously, we will be addressing open space notices, etc.
Because in essence, that may, I mean, I'm not being a legal expert, obviously, but may provide a little bit more time at the beginning to make sure that time is taken away at the end.
Possibly. The only other thing, though, is obviously it's only until they would go through the whole CAP process that heads of terms are agreed, and at that point we would then be instructed, so we wouldn't know beforehand the length of term, for example, what type of rights or regulations they want to put, exceptions they want to put within a lease document. So that wouldn't help even if we knew at the outset. Sorry.
And my final question is about, you mentioned in the information earlier, which is really useful to know, is that engaging a solicitor on terms of the person who wants to take on the asset transfer, that you would directly deal with the legal representative rather than the individuals or the group themselves. Is there any circumstances where you would envisage them not needing to engage a legal representative?
There are some circumstances where they don't wish to engage with legal representatives. It's always easier if they do have a legal representative, because obviously these are legal documents, and it is our duty to tell any third party that we strongly recommend they get independent legal advice, because at the end of the day they are entering into legal documentation, and also they can have to deal with the registration after we completed these documents, which isn't that straightforward.
Forgive me of my ignorance on the terminology. So in terms of a lease or a legal document or license, do we as an authority insist on a notary, somebody of legal to sign it?
No, a legal document would be signed by the person that's entering into it. It has to be witnessed, but that witness can be anybody over the age of 18. But we would strongly recommend they do get legal independent advice on it.
Okay, that's really helpful. Are there any other questions from the panel? Things that people would like to know or ask?
If I can, Chair, yeah.
Yeah, Councillor Jeffrey.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's a simple question, or is it really? When a transfer takes place, does the ownership depart from the council to the third party who may be buying this or acquiring the land or the building or whatever it might be? Is it a total transfer, or does the council have some degree of ownership on that item, whatever that may be?
It depends on what's been agreed. It's, as a local authority, I think it's our policy that we do leases, not freehold sales. But if it was a freehold sale, that would be out of the council's ownership, and we'd have very little control. We could put restrictions in the document that's transferring the property, but our control really would go. But most often it's going to be a lease of the land, so we would be the landlord, so we would still have some control over the land. That's correct.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. One last point I know came up quite a lot in the discussions. I've seen that Jeff Bacon as well wanted to come in. I'll bring you in a second, Jeff.
Okay.
Is we talked about the value of the yellow license, as it's nicknamed or named, for community centres and how they work. Is there any legal use you think that we may use them beyond community centres for pieces of land?
I'm really sorry, I don't know what the yellow license is, so I don't know if Jeff will be
I
able
think
to
Jeff
say.
might be able to help us
No,
with this, or Tracy McNulty.
I'll come back on a couple of points. Firstly, just to remind everyone that the community asset transfer policy is quite clear that any transfer will be by way of a lease. It still means that the council retains the freehold interest. You're granting a tenancy of a term to be determined, which could be 10, 15, 25, 50 years, for example, but it means that the council can retain control in terms of, in particular, use. So there isn't an outright transfer to an organisation who could the next day sell to someone for anything they wish, subject to planning. So it's always on that basis. So I can't think of any examples where we've done a community asset transfer where it's an outright freehold, and not many organisations or local authorities would do such. The yellow licence is a standard form of licence, which basically means there is continued support for community groups to run community centres, and they still have that continued support from Tracy's team. So it enables an element of autonomy, but it means there is still a lot of support and control from the local authority, so it will only be used for that particular purpose. The key thing is it's a standard format, and this is where I come back to the policy again. That what can often take a huge amount of time is a negotiation beyond the agreement of heads of terms when it comes to the format of a lease. So that's where it can spill out into months and months and months when you have that toing and froing between an organisation and their solicitors and us and our solicitors, when the reality is the principles are agreed at the outset, but it becomes complex and all of a sudden an organisation thinks, well, I don't really want to take responsibility for that or that tree or that fence or whatever. And that's where you wouldn't actually have that with an outright freehold sale, because once it's done, it's done. But it's a very similar principle for a lease here, but it comes down to that level of responsibility that can often lead to protracted negotiations, which is why they often take a huge amount of time. Does that help? Tracy may want to come in on the licence. I may have explained that really badly. Sorry, Tracy.
Thank
No,
you,
no, at all.
Jeff. Tracy.
Thank you, Chair. Two, I suppose, related comments. With the yellow licence, it has been a device to enable greater community action, which is different to the notion of an asset transfer. So it basically sets out an agreement with a community group to establish a governance model, fairness, equity, but the council retains responsibility for the building. So we basically would change the boiler. We pay all the bills and then we recharge the community group for their use, and they get to keep all the income for all the dance classes and karate clubs and things like that take place. So it is very different. One of the reasons I can't imagine it working particularly well to an asset transfer is because the number of actors on the stage, if I kind of go with that analogy, it's very rarely a single organisation that we're working with. The applications generally come in for sites where there are lots of different groups using these sites. So the group has to, undertake its own engagement, its own consultation, bring, whether they're a local junior football club or a bowls club or a tennis players. They need to bring all these people with them into a single proposal and a credible business plan. Otherwise, we'd spend the next couple of years trying to resolve arguments amongst the group. And usually it's motivated by the need to have a lease because there is some funding opportunity attached to it. So the yellow license thing does become a little bit redundant, really, because they would never be able to achieve the kind of sums that have been announced recently if there was no long tenure agreed. So I wanted to say about all the multiple groups, because quite often, the council gets sort of in the frame as the bad guy taking ages, and quite often the protracted debates can take place between the different groups that are using any open space as well. So, you know, we are one of many actors.
Thank you, Tracy. I thought that's probably the case with the security of tenure, especially the grants and funding that people would like. I mean, I know we in passing discussed about a letter of intent for associated to the yellow license, but it's been useful to have that open discussion here because it seems that asset transfer is more down to establishing a lease or some form of stronger tenure anyway. Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have any other comments or questions that they would like to ask Debbie or Sally-Ann? Okay, I'd like Sue, Councillor Jones.
Yes, I think it was mentioned that legal get a lot of hassle because people don't realise when legal coming in. How can we raise awareness of when legal are entitled to contribute to an asset management? Does that make sense?
Okay, who would like to say that? Sally-Ann or Deb like to take that?
Yeah, I was just going to say it probably would help if at the outset they were aware of the process, clearly aware of the process of what they have to go through, and at what stage each party gets involved within the council. Because, as I said, it's not until the terms have been agreed that legal would then be in correspondence with either the third party or their solicitor, hopefully, their legal representative.
So, like a menu, for want of a better word, of when you actually are involved with that process would be perhaps useful to those coming into that situation of wanting to adopt.
I think, Councillor Jones, it's probably useful to know internally what that menu would be like, when you'd expect legal to be before discussions maybe get sort of further forward. I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any other points you wanted to raise, Sue, before I bring
No,
Jo
that
in?
was all, because to get everybody clear on the process, more or less, yes.
Okay, great. Councillor Hale.
Oh, cheers. Thanks very much. Can I ask Sally if anyone's ever been in breach of a lease agreement and we've had to bring the lease back in?
Not during my time with the local authority, no. We do try to work with the community groups to ensure that they don't breach the leases.
And I don't know this if this has been asked before or in a meeting that I might have missed, but how do we make sure that the people that are coming forward for a lease agreement are the right people? As in, do they have the knowledge, experience, training, etc., etc.? And is that a legal thing, or is that something that starts at the front of the lease agreement, or when someone identifies an opportunity? Thanks.
Yes, that's something that's come up before, and it's in terms of due diligence, it's something which would more be with the Home Department. So I think Jeff may be able to add a little bit more, or Tracy onto that stage.
I will come on a couple of points there. I mean, just to go back to everyone understanding when lawyers will be involved, the legal team will be involved. Rest assured, whenever my team are there involved from the originating department in terms of negotiating heads of terms, every party will be aware that there is a process in terms of authority, and after that authority has been given by way of cabinet, then lawyers will be instructed. So no one won't come at any surprise to anyone. That's basically going to happen. To give the likes of Sally-Ann and Debbie some credit, they're not just sitting there waiting for instructions. They have a huge amount of caseload. I think we will all agree there is insufficient resource across the organisation to manage it properly, and whilst it may be the ideal to have early involvement from the legal team, I think we're probably mindful of the fact that they haven't really got the time to get involved at that level of detail. It should be a straightforward process. as is outlined in the CAP policy, there is, if you had standard leases, standard agreements, and basically it's approved, then that lease should follow. But it's often that post-negotiation that can cause some issues and delays. To answer sort of Councillor Hale's question, it is rare that we take any sort of legal action against a tenant for non-performance of covenants, because quite frankly, it's incredibly difficult to do it. Quite often there's nuances around compliance, and when you look at the robust nature of some of the organisations who are looking to take on some of these community asset transfers, they will probably fail if you're looking at a straightforward business. They're quite often volunteers or voluntary organisations or small football clubs and the like. I don't think they'd probably pass any great sort of checks and balances when it comes to their strength. You have to trust in the community and give them their head to enable them to take some of these things forward. I think the reality is we wouldn't do any if we had a robust approach when it comes to checking on covenants. This is all about giving the community their head and their voice to enable them to sort of take some of these opportunities forward. It's not a magic bullet, nor is it an ideal process, but it's one that we are trying to work within, and I guess we'll probably see some of the outcomes of the scrutiny group in terms of how they think we could best manage it. And additional resource would be ahead of my recommendation. I think one I made at the outset, that will be a big help.
Thank you, Jeff. Tracy would like to come in on that before I bring Councillor Will Thomas in.
Yes, if that's okay, Councillor Thomas. Conscious. Thank you, Chair. I wanted to, I suppose, say a couple of clear things. It isn't that we've got a policy to try and transfer council assets into the community. It's that we have a policy to respond in a timely way and in a fair way, the same to everybody when we do get those inquiries. Those inquiries will be generated either from, some previous UK government's agendas around community asset transfer, more localised opportunities in terms of funding, and also word of mouth. All of these groups, they are part of the same leagues, they're part of the same networks. None of us are one-dimensional, and people know that somebody else has had a lease and got a grant, and then they'll think about assembling themselves into a similar position to try and secure investment in local playing fields and so on. But they aren't, just a sort of random group of individuals who might be trying to get hold of a park for alternative uses. They will be clubs and organisations that are really well known to in particular, people in my service team who will have been working with them for years and years and years. They will understand where they sit in the FAW pyramid. They'll understand what opportunities and investment may unlock. They'll also know what similar facilities are half a mile down the road and whether or not the business plan is sustainable. I mean, I used an example of Underhill previously. It took us about 3 years. There was officers in cultural services working with MCA and the Rangers to develop the very first business plan. It wasn't the last business plan, and the whole thing did take a long time, but it's a success story. So they don't come in with just a random idea and then have to be put through the mill and agonising months of legal speak. They are people we have already been working with, and we do advise them and might say to them, don't go for a 3G pitch here. There's one half a mile down the road that's failing because of lack of demand, or etc., or things like floodlights. But as I say, the asset transfers, I would say in nearly every case that I've been part of, motivated by access to grants and seeing how other people are benefiting from grants and being able to, get better facilities for their communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Will Thomas, thanks for being patient. Will.
No problem. Thank you. Just one thing that's just popped into my mind that I'm not sure, maybe Deb, you could advise if I do have an interest in this, because I'm obviously a member of Mumbles Community Council, which have got a number of live asset transfers going on. So I just wanted to get your advice on that quickly before I sort of...
No, it's fine, because the discussion today, Councillor Thomas, is in general terms. We're not discussing any specific disposals, so that's fine.
Okay, so thank you very much for clarifying that. Cheers. So as I mentioned, obviously I've been involved in a number of proposed and asset transfers. The only successful one that's gone through was part of Langland Tennis Courts, which we applied for the whole of Langland Tennis Courts as a Mumbles Community Council, and we were given some. The Underhill one is probably an example, as Tracy said, it's success, it's working, it's a great hub, but it still hasn't been finalised. So I think that's with legal, it's still sitting with Swansea Council. It's quite a bit messy actually. So that's an example of how we can streamline things, I think. One of the things that I'm struggling to get my head around, and what I'd like to just clarify is when at the first point of contact, I should know this because we've done it a few times, but at the first point of contact, when interest is applied to the Swansea Council, is it purely the Cabinet member's decision whether that goes further or not, or does it go to Cabinet automatically? That's my question, please.
Thank you, Will. Jeff, do you want to come in?
I don't think I want to answer that one. No, I don't really know the answer to that one. I think it would be rare. I think if anything came, if it didn't work its way through the Cabinet, if there was going to be a question mark around it. I can't think of any. There must be some, but I imagine there'd be a lot of consultation, discussion before anything was ever dismissed as not being brought forward. But you might have to hold the line on that one. There may be some that can judge by your face say, well, some have been rejected at the first point in principle, so maybe there are. On the question of this is important. It's difficult because you're going to delve into a bit of detail, and I won't be if you're not careful. But the issue about the legalities that are holding up the Underhill Park are interesting because they're not an issue of lack of resource or willingness in the council. I think it's an issue with another community group who have a legal interest on that in that area. I think so. That's a good example of where we have some difficult balance to strike between the wider community when some parts of your community are all on board and some may find they are not so much. I may be wrong, but I think that is just a nod from Deb or Sal might help in terms of that respect. But I think there may be an issue there about surrender of licenses that need to happen before the whole lease can be granted. But I won't go into detail because that isn't appropriate, I think.
Okay.
That's very cryptic, wasn't it? But it's not a case of there's not legal officers sitting on their hands doing nothing. I think there is something that is causing us some difficulty to enable the final execution.
Yeah, that aside, Chair, if you don't mind, could I just ask the question again about when it's presented to, if a potential asset transfer is presented, is it just the Cabinet member's decision on whether that goes forward, or does it go to Cabinet or a wider group? Is there an established group, or is it just the Cabinet member, or do they have a discussion? Is there an email? Is there what happens? What's the process of the reply to that, please?
Tracy, you want to pick that one up?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Tracy, take it quick.
I thought, sorry, I didn't realise my hand had come down. Yeah, so sorry, just to order my thoughts on this. It's pretty much the work is done in the background, and then we will take a view between officers of whether we think it's viable or not. And that view is informed by the understanding that there are multiple groups that need it, the status of the organisation has made the application, the intention of their long-term vision, and I've only in my time, which is 10 years this month, I've not in Swansea. I mean, I've not been in a situation where we've made a unilateral decision as officers, but we have given our advice to the Cabinet member that we do not think as officers we support this application going forward, and the reasons why. And that is part of, as I understand it, the delegations in terms of how we work with the community and groups. If the recommendation is that it really stacks up, it would bring into good use a parcel of land and secure investment. A recommendation goes forward and then kicks in the whole process that has to arrive at Cabinet eventually, because the length of the leases do count as a disposal. But we have had one quite recently where we've recommended that we don't take it through that process because of the conflict of use and the demand by a much wider pool of interested parties to a particular site. I suppose it is up to the cabinet member to take that advice or not, then really, I guess.
Thanks. Yeah. So, I mean, what I'm trying to get at, I suppose, is a kind of like a formal response and a uniform response that everyone gets treated the same. And maybe I'm not sure that's always happened in the past. Certainly not from my experience. But I think it's important moving forward that any asset transfer, big, small, whatever group, goes through the same process, the same committee. Maybe it meets quarterly, maybe it reports to cabinet. So everyone's treated the same, and that process, the reply, same form, same response, all uniform. That would be one of the comments I'd have. Thanks.
Tracy?
I was just going to say that the process is exactly the same, certainly from my experience. The officers in my team that work, they tend to be, our requests tend to only be for sports spaces. So, you know, I am quite limited in that experience. Obviously, the community centres are different. So we go through exactly the same process. We look at the uses, we look at the landscape in terms of adjacencies, who uses what, sites, and all the other commonalities of successful spaces, such as whether it's car parking or whether it's, you know, even worth, you know, pursuing the conversation. Generally, as I say, the only one we recommend to be turned down would be because there are just so many people who use a space that, you know, to get into a situation where it is assigned to just one organisation would just waste everyone's time and money. But I was really coming back on the bit about, you know, having these things by committee, because quite often they come in very hard and fast with we need to know by next Friday because we want to apply for a grant. So if we had a process that was about, you know, if we know something is dead in the water, why would we make them wait months and months and months and go through getting, you know, surveys and everything done? But then if we also had that, we can move more quickly in terms of we make the recommendation, it's worth pursuing, and then it takes a long time anyway from there. But at least there is a well-trodden path, as much as we've understood, especially from this inquiry, that path can be quite obscure to people who are outside looking in. And we all have our own sort of, you know, thoughts about resources, but I think that we are all agreed that if we had an absolute go-to person, but we're all trying to do the bits at the edges for our own specialisms. I'm not sure we'll ever have someone who is so specialist in every single part of the process that can just cover it all off seamlessly. But we do recognise that we are leaning on different specialisms at different times without a single coordinator. So I'm not sure if I could work with something that only met every few months, because quite often we've got to give someone a response within 5 or 10 days. So just a comment.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. I do feel probably there is some benefit from a standardised approach that we know from transparency sides of things will be helpful. Councillor Sue Jones, you'd like to make a point?
I just wondered if the ward councillors were involved in any conversation.
Would you like me
want to pick that up?
Yeah, I'm happy to share from my perspective. It really, if we're talking about asset transfer, and quite often we're talking about, you know, uses, one-off friends activity, but if we're talking about asset transfer, it is matter for cabinet, and in that process we will be going through publishing the notice, and in the publishing that notice, particularly if it's open space, then the ward members would be statutory consultees within that process as well, I believe.
Thank you, Tracy.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have any other points before I move on to the next agenda item? Thank you. Oh, Debbie.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted, I wasn't able to come in at Jeff's request to confirm what's happening in Mumbles because I'm not aware of it, and but I am aware though, Jeff, that there is sometimes miscommunication between when you've got several interested parties all having lawyers, and sometimes it's quite easy to say, oh, it's with the council, because that seems to be a stock response in many cases. But we aren't able, as Sally-Ann has said, to respond directly to organisations on the ground where they've got lawyers. And I know we have had examples where we've had to say to lawyers, can you let your clients know what's happening? Because they seem to think the delay is with the council, and it's not. So it is awkward, I think, where you've got multiple parties having conflicting interests around the same piece of land and often not being on the same page. I don't really know what we can do about that. I think that's just general transaction communication, really, that you get with most legal matters. But it often doesn't help when you've got that miscommunication going on.
Thank you. Any other points before we move on to the next section? Okay, if we can move on then to item 7, which is the findings report. I just also wanted to thank the legal team for joining us for that section as well. In terms of the findings report, it's been divided up, if you've probably seen the report, into 14 main areas and of the findings. And I wanted to quickly go through each of those. Some of them will need more discussion than others, and some of them we can just pass over because they're self-explanatory. We are hoping to have in our next meeting a group meeting with Michelle. You can correct me if I'm wrong, which would be focused on the members of the panel alone. But I'm happy to have an informal discussion at the end of this meeting as well, if available. Okay, so if I look at the report, if you look to page 4, you'll see that there is a beginning of the outlines of the report. So I just wanted to thank Michelle for pulling this all together for us. The first one, and this is an interesting one, is about the philosophy of the whole idea, and it's, should we go ahead with it at all, or it should be something that we're doing. If anybody wants to come in on that, the legal team can leave if they wish to in this time, but if anybody wants to pick up this point 1, they can. Tracy?
Chair, sorry, I wasn't sure if I was allowed to come in on this bit, as might be a panel thing, but while the legal team is still here, I'm trying to think of the year. I think it was something like 2012 or something, and there was a UK policy applied for community asset transfer, and I remember it being something the then local government minister pretty much mandated on local authorities, and we were all sort of running around a bit. It might have been the Essex guy Pickles. Can't quite remember. But in terms of what I said earlier about, it's not so much that we've got a policy for transferring our assets, but it's that we've got a policy for dealing with the inquiries, because there are these other national agendas to enable the transfer of assets to the community. So I'm just wondering to other colleagues if that is something we would actually ever be able to say we don't do that here.
I think, to pick up your point, you're right. There's probably still a legal requirement to have some provision to be able to do it. I think from what we found in our inquiry so far is some authorities are more proactive in terms of offering spaces, or they may well sort of try to positively sell the idea, whereas we've taken an approach, which is approach in itself, to deal with any requests that people come forward. So that's the approach that we've had. I know that some of the consultation, when we sent out as a panel for feedback from people, some of the consultation suggested that we shouldn't actively do anything in terms of this area, and they would prefer us to keep our own assets. So it was just one of those ideas as a part of the findings or feedback that we've had that I just wanted to float out there to see if anybody wanted to make any comments on it. Councillor Thomas.
Yeah, the only comment I'd make, Chair, is I think, you know, the focus is always going to be local. So, you know, anyone locally is going to be more motivated. And if you're a football team and you care about your football team, you know, you're going to obviously have a lot more time and resources to put into making sure that succeeds. So I think it's important for us to help communities. And I think it's something we should definitely be doing, because it means a lot to a lot of these, what are small assets to the council and often not profitable assets. They can mean a lot to the local communities once they're transferred over. So yeah, I think it's definitely something we should be doing.
Thank you. Councillor Hell.
Yeah, I've always taken the same view that it's tantamount to selling off the family silver, and save. It might work well in the more prosperous areas of Swansea, but over we are in Port Tennant and St Thomas, we don't have much open space. We got Kilvay Hill behind us, we got the sea in front of us, so every bit of open space is used by all the residents, not just one particular group or community group or association. So selling off the family silver, not a good idea. We should be looking after it for future generations. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on that part of the findings? Okay, the next one did gather quite a lot of comment, and that's about consultation. And I think it was almost looking at what the basic level of consultation that should be accepted would be. And I know that Councillor Jones mentioned about ward councillors earlier in our conversation today. Are there any other remarks or things that people want to say about the basic level of consultation? I feel that's where we need to find a consistency to make sure that certainly ward members are involved in each of the consultations, and there is a proper consultation with the local community. Because I think some of the issues we may have had with some of the transfers or prospective transfers in the past is where we haven't really met that standard. Councillor Thomas.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, obviously you've got the standard form, ward members need to be consulted upon. And I think the consultation in the community would have to be done by the group before they're applying, you know, or before it goes too far. And that consultation also needs to be somehow standardized. I don't know how they do that, and that's a meeting in itself, I'm sure. But, you know, some kind of standardized consultation, business plan, and, you know, to see that there's a formulated body which has been set up, which has got constitution and everything before even the first, well, maybe you could have an exploratory meeting with an officer and then, you know, be given these details. But yeah, I think it needs to be uniform, and the consultation needs to be somehow standardized to make sure that it's a good enough level to be representative of the community. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. One of my concerns here, I think, sort of raising it would be, as it's very much the onus at the moment is on the community group itself coming forward with things. How do we make sure as a council that what our role is in that consultation or checking it, and also ensuring that that community group isn't just providing consultation that's an echo chamber of its own views and what it wants to achieve? I appear to have silenced everyone with that one. So is there any other consultation that points that people want to raise? Okay, the next thing which was quite important was really the support through the process for applicants. We did talk about a single point of contact as being quite an important point of that. Has anybody else got any other remarks, things that they would like to add to the finding reports about that? I can remember at our last meeting, SCVS said that they would help support through the process groups and try to give them a bit of a guide. And I think that would be something worth us looking at and exploring in the findings. And we also talked about something that's linked into the fourth point, which is mentoring or peer support. Anybody else got any comments, things that they would like to add at this stage to that? Councillor Thomas?
Thanks. Yeah, just being involved in a few of these things. I think often, because you can go a few months where people sort of forget where they are in the process. And like the clerk for the community council, if they go away or they're on holiday, or in our case, the clerk sadly died. But obviously we're looking for one point of contact, which is the ideal, but obviously that's not always possible with these community groups because people move, they change. So I think it might be an idea to have some kind of shared drive or shared doc where, you know, there's some kind of document hub for each project, and it's very easy to do on Teams these days. So you know, I think that might be something that's beneficial to the process from both sides. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Officer. I think we saw something similar maybe from Southampton where there were shared examples and things. Councillor Jones, Sue.
I'm looking at more of consultation with the area, and wondered if a public meeting should be essential to make certain that everybody in that community knows the asset is going on.
And that's really, I suppose, what you're picking up there, Sue, is beyond an open spaces notice is having a follow-up physical consultation, and even when an open space notice isn't relevant, to have some form of almost formal consultation or awareness of the scheme. Is that right?
Well, I know it's the responsibility of the group to make certain that the community is behind them. And how do we ensure that's happening? Maybe there's a tick box, what consultation they've actually put forward, so that the public meeting is part of it, because not everybody's on social media and all these different ways of informing the public in their own communities.
And would perhaps maybe an idea of some sort of notice on the property itself beforehand, even whichever way it is, to make sure people are aware of it?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any other points on those that before we have a look? I mean, we talked about the single point of contact before. I think everybody's agreed, and it's points that the officers and the legal team had said there. It's probably who that single point of contact would be, because would it be somebody within estates? Would it be somebody probably in legal? Or it's probably more the host department, I would have thought might be the single point of contact. But then it gets confusing of who to go to. Jeff, do you have some ideas of how to help us with that?
Yeah, it wouldn't be estates or legal, put it that way. I think there needs to be if there is going to be sufficient resource applied to this, and I think that's the answer to lots of the questions here. If you're going to do this properly, it needs to be properly resourced. And I'd be interested to know some of the more proactive authorities, the level of resource they have in distinct teams, perhaps to inform this. You know, I've heard tale of RCT having half a dozen officers who deal with community asset transfers, and that appears to be about the mark if you're going to have a property officer and a legal officer and a specialist across the community areas who would need to support when it comes to wider consultation and public meetings, because they're not easy to organise, and sometimes they might be difficult meetings. So I think it comes down to the question as to whether we do, if you want to make some formal recommendations about how to take this forward, I think that's a gap that needs to be filled. I think it needs to be something that, if it is going to be that complex, you're looking at a relatively sizable dedicated team. Because it may be you take something to a public consultation meeting and not everyone's aboard with it, so does it stop at that point? Who makes that call?
I think that's a really useful point. Certainly what's come up throughout the inquiry is resources and being able to resource it, suitably. And it all depends on, I suppose, as well, what principle you want to take going forward. If you want to be more proactive, then we certainly would need to put a lot more resource into it. If we wanted to even sustain and improve what we have now in terms of the support for the people going through the process, it seems that we would need to identify more resources to be able to enable that to happen. Okay, does anybody else have any, while we're on the resources matters, does anybody else want to make a point on that? No. We've got a group of them in 8, which are called Process Probity and Swansea Policy Vision and Strategy. As a part of the findings or recommendations, I suppose, is it that we would be looking to ask the council to look again at its policy? Is that something that you feel as a group we want people to look at? Councillor Holly, Chris.
Yeah, I think the old principle of what we're discussing and all the findings report is all down to policy. And I think if we are going to pursue, I have some sympathy with what Joe has said, Councillor Joe Hill has said about, where are we going with it? But I think we really do need to think again about how a policy and what we're actually doing with it. Yes, it's all well and good community groups getting involved and what have you, but some of them fail, some don't, but there we are. But I think this section, this finding about policy, I think is one that we need to discuss as elected members as opposed to anyone else. And I think it is incredibly important that we do have that discussion.
I agree with you on that one, Chris. I think certainly we need to pick that one up and go through that together. In terms of it, when we look at a community asset transfer or a property or a piece of land, it's got to really be the best option that we alight on for the community and for the land or the asset itself. And that's something we don't really have that space to talk about or even to look at in policy terms at the moment, I think. Okay, so the next one is interesting for you elected members out there. Do you think there should be more information or training or information given to community councils about the process of community asset transfer and maybe how we could assist as elected members in that? I see Councillor Jones nodding away. Councillor Jeffrey agrees. What would that look like? What kinds of help do you think we'd need?
I think that the reality of it is not so much what help we need, is understanding what the process is. And there is something in the paperwork to give you a flow chart. And I think that's the problem, unless like Will and others who have been involved in it don't understand the flow chart. And I think that's really what we need. I don't think training is an aspect that is going to be required. I think it's understanding the flow chart and telling members it's there.
Okay, do people agree with Chris?
Raising awareness of how it works. Yeah.
I think that seems sensible. One of the things is probably about managing expectations and timescales. Is there anything that we should try to do as a recommendation or finding to do with the timescales? Is it something that we can try to help in the process, or any forward information that we have about making sure that people are aware that this isn't an overnight decision or it takes a few minutes to resolve? Councillor Thomas, can you help me with that one?
Yeah, I mean, obviously all the departments are stretched, especially the legal department when it comes to this, I feel. Is there any option for people in groups looking to take on the assets to, potentially pay towards the legal fees, or to speed things up, or indeed to cover the costs of the council? I know obviously a lot of these groups are small groups and they haven't got any money, and they'll say we haven't got any money. But would it help then with our resources? Like, would we be able to then do things more efficiently? So it's just a question on if it's worth us charging for our resources. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Would any of the officers like to take that up, or is it something that maybe we could take your advice from outside of the meeting? Debbie, if you want to come in, then, and then I'll bring in Chris afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. I think for us in legal, we don't get that many community asset transfers coming through to us in terms of the a proportion of our workload. It's quite a small number, so we don't feel that it's a huge issue resource-wise for us. I know it probably feels that they're not being dealt with in a speedy way, that there is delay, but I don't know necessarily whether that's due to lack of resource or just because of the complexity of the transactions and they go as fast as they go. I'd have to speak to Sally Ann in a little more detail, but it wasn't, I don't think for me it's on my radar as a matter that we need to necessarily increase the legal resource for. Charging, fees wouldn't really help us. It would generate some income, which is always obviously good, but it wouldn't allow us to take on another member of staff or anything like that. And as I say, I don't think we would need another member of staff, although I will defer to Sally because it's Sally Ann's team I'm talking about. But I think it's a very small proportion, Sal, of your workload.
Yeah, that's correct. It's not a huge proportion of our workload, but you've got to appreciate we do have a large workload, which involves a lot of other areas and to do with, strategic sites and grant funding, etc., which is also very much pinch points.
Thank you. Chris, you want to come in now and then I'll bring Tracy in straight afterward?
Yeah, fine. I totally oppose to charging. I think charging could end up being the death knell for many of these things. But apart from that, I think charging that then increases the expectation of the people that are coming in. They say, oh, we're going to give you 10 grand. We want it done tomorrow. So I don't think that's helpful at all. And I think if we went down the road of saying that, yeah, it might be handy, the income itself, but it then gives expectations to the people that are applying for that asset transfer. And I think that's probably worse than anything else. That would put more pressure on the council, more pressure on the individuals in the various teams. I don't think that's a good idea at all.
I tend to agree with you on that one, Chris. Tracy.
Thank you. Just going to be a bit of a stuck record and just repeat the need for us to make sure that we're really clear on the process and the stages that we go through, because the very first inquiry is it surplus to our requirements as an authority? Do we have any plans for it? If the answer is no, we think to ourselves, will it provide us with savings by transferring it? And actually, will it improve the amenity for the community? Will they be able to get investment to it that we're very unlikely to ever prioritise? So those are the very first checks. So we're introducing charges to a group in that process, I think, would add a complexity that would make it really difficult to move beyond that very first stage. The only other thing I would say is that, despite what you've heard, I think it is time consuming, isn't it, working with community groups? But that's what we're here for. And these are individuals. Even one community group rarely speaks with a single voice, and they quite often have different views of how things should be done with them. But even so, it's not really a full-time job for someone in my team. And I can imagine that we'd have one person being able to do all the different aspects of it, because it is so multidimensional. But I can imagine that those 6 people in RCT, Jeff, are a little bit of my Gemma, a little bit of Sally, a little bit of Dave, a little bit of whoever, but they understand in their job role that they are the service representative in this process. Because so Gemma is probably the first one within the process from cultural services point of view. But Gemma's also working with allotments and friends groups and community centres and friends of parks. And so I couldn't imagine that this would be a full-time job for her. She might be for a few weeks, just living and breathing and pulling her hair out over one single transaction and dialogue. But I'm not sure it would be justified in the sense that it might have been intended. What do you think, Jeff?
Sorry, can I come in, Chair?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Yeah, I was invited by Tracy, so I'll come in.
Sorry, I was a bit cheeky.
I think, to be honest with you, I speak about resources because it speaks to the purpose of this group, doesn't it? I mean, it's been a long group and it's been an intense group, and I think it's probably identifying they think something's wrong with the system. So, and I think from my experience, I had a member of staff who was probably spending a large chunk, if not the majority of his time, dealing with the community asset transfers because he was filling a void. He was trying to deal with some of the queries that weren't being answered elsewhere, and was a focal point for the organisations, because they felt they needed a focal point. And I don't think that was the right way to deal with it. And I think the fact he's now gone is meant that he's moved on to another job. He hasn't moved past on. Has led to the fact we have a gap, and we're trying to work out how we can best fill it. I'd like to simplify the processes wherever we possibly can to make it as straightforward as possible. I don't think it is straightforward because there's never two examples that are the same. I think this is the problem, because every community is different, every asset seems to be different, and everyone seems to be complex, so it needs someone to help them through the process. And I think if you look at the numbers we've dealt with, there's been scores of community asset transfers that have gone through the system, and there could be scores more. If we decide we're not going to do any, then that makes the process that much more straightforward. But I think that would probably land badly with community groups who want to take on some of the facilities. Sorry, I've talked around the subject. I think there is a need, Tracy. I really do think there is a need, because the reality is that we're not doing it right now. And I think part of it is going to be as a result of lack of somebody to take the process forward. And I do defend my legal colleagues. I think they are very busy, and what they tend to do is react to whoever's shouting the loudest. And sometimes it could be a community group, or it could be a developer who wants to spend tens of millions of pounds, but they just have to deal with whatever one needs to be dealt with at that moment in time. And they do a grand job in those circumstances, to be fair. I think if there was more resource, I'd welcome it.
You, Tracy?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we just need to get our heads around it as officers, what that looks like, because as I say, it's, the large amount of land stuff. I can imagine, we might be able to sit with the group, talk about the group, feel confident that there's something worthwhile, and that an old bit of land in between, some old recreation ground somewhere is now going to be better used and better resourced, or a football pitch that's always been used by the same group is actually going to have an investment in it, those sorts of things. But it's that, question mark over where that resource is most burdensome. And, from what Jeff is saying, it sounds like it is in the property team and to a degree the legal team. But I'm not sure we've absolutely got our head around the point of leadership, because even if it was in cultural services, not every transaction going forward is going to be relating to the things that the culture team could consult on. So I feel like I'm at a loss as to whether or not I think it's a whole team, or whether it is in other people's just in job descriptions, because we've been weaving it into our job descriptions as they've become vacant, and we've had some shared prosperity funded posts which we might be able to retain, but I don't think it deals with what Jeff's describing, which is much more of a kind of land assessment, all the diligence side of it.
Jeff, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I think it's maybe a conversation the officers have to have outside the room, dependent upon the outcome of the report. I'm not entirely sure if it is a property or a legal point. It's the softer side of things that can be more difficult. If there's a straightforward case of this asset is surplus, sell it, we can deal with it really quickly. If this asset is surplus, lease it to this particular organisation. We can come up with very, very straightforward terms and conditions, which would then lead into heads of terms that we'd be instructing legal services, and it's easy. It's the soft side that gets difficult, because you try and impose what will be standard terms and conditions, and quite often they're the things that can be difficult. And I think it's getting to the point of declaring an asset surplus, having an agreement with the group to take it on, having the wider consultation. That's the thing that takes the time. The property in the legal term should be really, really straightforward. You'll have standard lease, Bob's your uncle, but it never ends up being that.
I think what tends to be from the inquiry so far that we need assistance is the support for the groups coming forward. So in a sense, what you're describing maybe is a softer side there, Jeff, is the support that's needed in the process, and also linking to the due diligence, the support checking up and following up on the items and the the robustness of the organisation going forward once they've taken on a lease. That's what I would kind of identify, which isn't dissimilar to maybe how some people, how the experience is with community centres, to a degree. People, that there is support there, that people continue to know that there. I'm not suggesting we mirror the exact same support, but it's the softer side, isn't it? Because you can make a legal decision, you can make a property decision, but it's really supporting that community group to make the most of what they've got.
And to help them once the lease is in place as well, to make sure they're not falling foul.
Okay, I mean, that leads on to the due diligence. Hopefully Tracy will pick up these points as well in response. I think that's the really important part of some of the discussions, is that we need to make sure that the organisation is robust enough to continue to go forward, and that it's doing it in the best interests of the community rather than a small select group of individuals who may benefit directly from it. So I don't know if you want to pick up from that, Tracy.
I was going to say, I think we do have, notwithstanding, we'll be back in budget setting at the end of the summer, and those teams are at risk of future planning for the medium-term financial plan. I think we do have the support in the team for that softer side. I think there's some kink in the system that I'm feeling a little bit unsure of, and I do think we probably need to have a meeting about it again, as we started prior to Lewis leaving, Jeff. Prior to Lewis and Jamie leaving, we were talking about these processes and what a dedicated resource might even look like. And I don't think we ironed that out. So I think we probably do need to reflect on what we're hearing and actually put a solid proposal together around it.
I think it links into point 13, not point 13, I'm sorry, the point 12, which is about defects, follow-up issues, things like that. It's almost, there needs to be a point for contact for that, between them having to just go directly to legal or to go to the property section. So I think it's another potential role for that individual or group or support group. I think we discussed 13 in a bit more detail earlier, which is a license and transfer lease option, unless anybody else wants to raise that. And 14 is, I suppose, is at the heart of the matter for me, which is, what are the benefits for the local community? Are the local community benefiting from this? Has it improved the lot of the situation, or has it avoided a difficulty happening or loss of this facility? I think that's the key thing, rather than a small group of individuals gaining from something. Does anybody have any points or things that they would like to raise on that? Okay, Councillor Hale.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's absolutely crucial, isn't it? Because we've seen over the years, particularly, I have to say, in England, where some of these asset transfers have taken place, and a small group of people have found themselves with parcels of land which used to maybe have a community centre on it. They've even managed to get the freeholds. And some of these have ended up in court. I've told Jeff about a couple of examples. I think one was down in Bournemouth or Eastbourne. And it was an ex-council officer who had retired, got his hands on the lease, and then somehow got his hands on the freehold. Made millions, but I think he ended up in Wandsworth. But this is a sort of thing that may happen, isn't it? And that's why we have to be cast iron guaranteed that it will only ever be a short lease, that it will only ever be to the benefit of the communities. Because at the end of the day, they are community assets, and we shouldn't be losing them. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor Hale. I think just follow on to that is that it may. I think what we also need to be cautious of in going forward is that it may be very beneficial to that group or to that particular area of interest, and it would look like a strong case unto itself. but then it's not really taking into consideration the wider community use of a space or a community facility. So I think that's something that we need to look at. And Tracy, would you like to come in on that one?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think Councillor Hale's right. There was something way before the time I actually worked in Eastbourne Borough Council. I just want to say that I'm not kind of moving these awful practices around. The notion of who these things are for, we do that piece of work within those early days, you know, where who is it being used for dog walking? Is it being maintained? Is it being well used? Is it where children play? Is it a place that, you know, maybe just is only used by single groups or many groups? So those things do feature. I'm not saying we're absolutely perfect. If we were perfect, we wouldn't be having this kind of dialogue. But I think there are a lot of really good aspects to what we do, and I just want to take a little bit of time to reflect on those, you know, the stuff that works really well, which is, you know, we did an open space strategy some years ago in order to inform this policy, where we mapped all the open spaces and where children can play, where people can walk, where people can just take part in recreation. And within that, we understood what are the pitches and what qualifies a pitch in terms of its maintenance and what kind of surface it is and how often it can be played on. So we've done, you know, a fair bit of work on that, and we continue to revisit that and look at it in informing those decisions. And quite often, I would like to say, if it's working well, that what happens is the community secures investment in a site that is so far down the list of priorities or capability of investment that maybe those communities would never see in their lifetime. Of course, the length of these leases is a concern to everybody. Somehow or other, and it was a very English thing, as I recall from my time there, with this idea of everything having to be 125 years has crept into the narrative. And I do think that's something that, you know, is fair to challenge, because 125 years is, you know, it's several generations and things get lost and forgotten in that time. So we know that we're looking at 25-year lease should be enough to secure funding. And it is something that, you know, myself and Jeff have talked about previously, about challenging this assertion from a group that to get a couple of £100,000, they need 125 years. And that, you know, nobody involved is going to be around in that time. So that's something I would just say is worth another poke at.
I think that's a really important point that you raised there, Tracy, and I'm sure that the rest of the group would also reflect the fact that anything over 25 years would be an exceptional circumstance, and I would be unkeen to see long leases given out as asset transfers, because having deal with funders every day, people don't want more than about 25 years. You know, that seems to be around the amount. The other point that was raised by Councillor Joe Howe is really important as well, is we need to avoid what I would loosely term a carpetbagger scenario, where somebody comes along with a small interested group of people who put a very strong case or look like a strong community case and take hold of or control of an asset to the exclusion of anybody else in the area. And that is something that we as a council have to be very cautious of, I think, to make sure that doesn't happen going forward. Or, you know, we need to make sure that we have things in place to avoid that kind of carpetbagger mentality. Okay, has anybody else got anything that they want to raise in the formal meeting under the findings report? Okay, so the next meeting that we'll have, Michelle, remind me of the date on that. That
we have a date in the diary at the moment. We have a date in the diary at the moment of just councillors.
So yeah, just to repeat that one, the next meeting is on the 23rd, or provisional on 23rd of September on a Monday. and that's just an informal meeting of councillors to discuss the findings report before a formal report is back then to an open meeting, which would then confirm the findings of that report before it goes on through the processes, which would end up in cabinet at that stage. So if anybody wants to stay on at this stage for an informal discussion of any of the points, then you're welcome to. If people just put a thumbs up if they want to stay, they can. Otherwise, I will formally ask Michelle to stop recording the meeting. We'll formally close the meeting. Okay, so it looks like there's at least one person who wants to stay on in terms of the members. I just want to thank the officers for all their help so far in the process. Okay, thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.